And we're live.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Lisa.
Hi, Josh. Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's having a great Wednesday.
Yes, a tumultuous weather Wednesday.
A little bit. It wasn't too bad here. We got a little wind last night, but we got a little rain, but not too bad. Just a little chilly.
Yeah, and of course, welcome to the Dark Ozarks.
Yes.
This is the beginning of a very special two-part episode. I feel like this is the ABC Family Special.
Just a little more macabre.
Much more macabre. Good times. But a very, very special date is you were keeping better track than I was. I knew we were within the ballpark of our second year anniversary for Dark Ozarks, and come to find out, today's the day.
Today is the second anniversary of the first show, and I'll be candid. I went and looked, so because I knew it was this week, but I couldn't remember exactly when, so I went and looked. So
yes, and you know, I think a lot of ups and downs for many of us. Pardon me. Over the past 2 years, but everything that we've done with Dark Ozarks, honestly, has just been phenomenal.
it really has, and just a lot of fun.
An enormous amount of fun. I look forward to every single one of these episodes. I think you do as well.
Yes.
And I am always so grateful that folks enjoy tuning in.
I do too, and so, thankfully, other people enjoy our warped sense of curiosity, I guess.
I'm very grateful for that, and we continue, of course, produce the show weekly, increasingly producing other things as well, including now, not that we weren't really before, but we've really been able to pick up production of events.
Yes, events and just on-site research and giving people a little more behind-the-scenes views at times, and that should continue to pick up. So.
And definitely continue. We've got lots and lots of behind the scenes planned, lots of new stuff planned. It is, I think, a testament to the Ozarks region and the Ozarks borderlands that every time we dig into a location or a story, there is actually so much more there than what we have time to share, even in just this format, which is still pretty in depth.
It is. It really is, and yeah, sort of that pulling the curtain back a little bit. In the beginning, worried about how long could this go? How much material is there? And I don't think the end is anywhere in sight.
And that I had forgotten, but early on we did have those conversations. Do we have enough material for, say, 12 episodes? Do we have all of this stuff? 2 years, 2 years in running, and we barely scratched the surface.
Well, yeah, our to-do list is longer than what we've covered. So.
And I've seen this. Of course, I'm very grateful. I've seen this now with Dark Ozarks. I also see it with State of the Ozarks. Probably the most common question I get asked as editor-in-chief is, do you worry about running out of stories? And I just go, no.
Yeah. Trying to figure out how to get them all covered is the question.
There's and there is so much. We don't often realize we live in a very culturally rich region.
That's true. Well, it's always easy to say home is boring. I think everyone wants to do that, and I think a lot of people in the Ozarks are susceptible to that, mainly from some of the travel promotions that have been done over the last century. That it's just smiling faces and that's it. There's a lot more to it.
It is a lot more to it. Layers and layers of history. some of which is very contemporary.
Yes.
Some of our macabre research and even our hauntings take us to situate into environments that are actually quite modern, and others date a really long time back. In some cases, before recorded history.
That's true. That is true. Some of the things that we do cover do go that far back. And if you're wondering what we're talking about, you need to check out other videos.
Exactly. We're not going to tell you here. You have to go look. We do. What we will tell you though is we have two events on the horizon. One coming up just next month.
Yes, April 23rd at the
Mhm.
Ritchie Mansion in Newtonia. Not just at the mansion. We're actually going to be in 3 spots in Newtonia. The community center, the mansion, and the Civil War cemetery. So
Mhm.
it's going to be a fun evening, a lot of history, a lot of hauntings, and then we'll do a demonstration of a paranormal investigation. So
Yes. Now we did have the opportunity. We did this last spring,
mhm.
and a lot of fun. Um,
Yes.
Great participation, and it is. I say this about a lot of places, and we're going to talk about some of those places tonight. But it is one of my favorite locations. It
Yeah.
is a beautiful, restored antebellum mansion,
Mhm.
and it is, again, so many times. And I grew up on road trips. I grew up road tripping, and looking out the window, and seeing historic locations, interesting homes, and thinking, wow, wouldn't it be amazing to somehow know somebody that would allow me to go look in this place and learn more about it, to see where it is from. That's a lot of what this night is about.
Yes, we're fortunate that we get a lot of those opportunities,
Yeah.
and Ritchie Mansion is one of those, and we're very honored. It's a great time for people to get together and learn about the local history and things that give a lot of context to the area.
Yes. Yeah. And it is a very rich area. It is a haunted location,
Hmm.
and there's a several locations both on property and then nearby that are haunted as well.
Very true, very true. And so, if you're interested, go to the event on the page. You can find the details, go buy tickets, and come on out on April 23rd. It'll be a good time.
Yeah.
Um, and then we have something really fun coming up
Mhm.
in October that we are just starting to talk about. So
Yeah, we got to get that on the radar and on folks' agenda. Dark Ozarks October Country.
yes, October 15th, it's going to be a day-long event at the VFW 534 in Joplin, Missouri, co-sponsored with Always Buying Books. And big shout out to Bob and Elise at Always Buying Books. Uh, if you are looking for uh, books, whether it's just um, modern fiction reading, history, whatever it is, go check them out because they have a phenomenal stock and a lot of really nice collectibles as well that I tend to drool over. There you go. There's
This
one.
is from there.
Yeah,
Please, example A.
example. Yeah.
I, 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 I don't know what this officially says. I mean, State of the Ozarks is an all online publication. We have created Dark Ozarks through an online platform. We work through the online mediums, can constantly, so on and so forth. We're doing it right now,
Hmm.
and yet there is magic and power in holding a book.
There really is. There really is. There's nothing like it. I don't care what anyone says. And I
No.
just read an article today that said that books, the physical books still, outsell digital books. I don't know, it was 15 to 1 or something like that.
There's something incredibly important and tactile, and I think in terms of perpetuating and perpetuating civilization, even that
Mhm.
is powerful, because as long as that book essentially says save,
Mhm.
you can pick it up and you can read the words that were spoken or created hundreds and hundreds of years earlier.
That's correct, and very relevant to your experience today. And at that, I have to just say, I just got a text flash over from our co-sponsor, gave me an idea. Perhaps we ought to just hint at project that goes along with that, that we're working on, that
I I like
hopefully will
that.
be available by October 15th.
I would. That would be fantastic.
Yes.
That would be fantastic. I think that's quite possible. So, Dark Ozarks has exciting things coming.
Yeah.
Us working together, and I'm yeah. Eh,
Yeah, are you not gonna say it? You gonna make me say it?
I didn't know how far we wanted. I didn't know how far. Do you want me to
I
just go
think we
ahead?
can at least discuss, that it's out there.
Yes. Okay. So, um, Dark Ozarks, myself, Lisa, will be co-authoring uh, a physical book, and
Yes.
it will be available as soon as we write it, because that's how
Mhm.
books work.
Yep.
And really taking cues. Of course, the what we're talking about tonight is not, it's not going to be a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of what's in the book, but taking
Right.
cues from tonight, in the sense that some of our favorite cases, some of our favorite stories, that unique juncture point between history, folklore, legend, reality, and investigation, where
Yes.
we look at things. Really, I think the book is going to be fun, because it's or we should add a disclaimer, I'm not sure which, because it is allowing the reader to explore these things from essentially inside our heads, getting
Yeah,
inside our heads and seeing how we approach some extremely varied topics and issues in the Ozarks.
exactly. And hopefully we are shooting for a fall release. So um
Hmm.
for this first volume, and anticipate more to come. So um
Yes,
keep that, in the back of your mind, and save your pennies, hopefully, if you're interested.
absolutely. Absolutely. And we're anticipating a nice sized book, but not cost prohibitive.
Exactly. Yeah, our goal is to get it in the hands of people. So
I'm Welsh and you're Scottish. It's not going to be an expensive book.
you say we're cheap.
Yes.
Yes. Low cost, as my dad used to say.
Yes. Oh, value added.
That's right.
So yes, mark your calendars. Prepare for a Dark Ozarks Volume 1.
There you go. So let's dive into some of our favorites. You want to throw
Mm.
one out first?
I will go first. I will go first. Christian County Bald Knobbers.
Okay. It's
Uh,
certainly one of the more asked about topics that we get.
it is that for me, one of the reasons it's my favorite, one of my favorites, um, it's a lot more of a complex human story than people realize.
Yes.
Um, I will make my Taney County folks mad at me by what I'm about to say. Um, I enjoy the history of the Christian County Bald Knobbers personally more, although they did not start the Bald Knobbers. The concept of the Bald Knobbers started in Taney County.
Mm-hmm.
For folks who might not be aware of that, Taney County is on the south, Christian County is on the north. They do border one another.
Yes.
And this is a period of social unrest and just heavy disruption of economic and social systems following the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you could also say it is a time of disruption of law and order.
Yeah, a vacuum, really.
Mm-hmm. And that created an opportunity for terrible things to happen. The thing that is the way there's several things. One is that the actual era of the Bald Knobbers was infinitesimally short
Mm-hmm.
compared to the shadow that it cast. The official reign of the Bald Knobbers was only 1885 to 1889. We're dealing with 4 years officially.
Of course, when you think about it, 4 years covered the Civil War, and look at the shadow it's cast too. I mean,
This
obviously
is true.
broader, across the country, but
Yes.
a lot of things can happen in a short time that
Yes.
do have impact.
Very, very, very. I think that's extremely insightful. I do think it's interesting. It's easy for folks in the region, certainly, and sometimes interregionally, to be aware of the term Bald Knobber,
Mm-hmm.
and oftentimes they have some concept, but there's still a lot of folks that just really don't know what it was about or how it came to be, how it ended, those types of things. But in speaking in comparatively quite broad terms, where the Taney County Bald Knobbers, which formed first, were really an attempt to restore law and order.
Yes. Basically, because the law wasn't there, kind of picking up the mantle and trying to make things safer for business and family.
Exactly. And that and we don't typically think of masked night riders as upstanding businessmen who are restoring, attempting to restore the judicial system, but that really was the beginning.
It definitely was the intent. And one thing I was going to throw in just before I forget was, when you're talking about the shadow it cast, that the term Bald Knobber eventually became a very generic term just for outlaws or violence across the region. And so you'll read references about Bald Knobbers that really are not Bald Knobbers. They're someone that's, just a gang of thugs.
Yes. And we have documentation of Bald Knobbers in Taney County, of course, Christian
Mm-hmm.
County, which we'll talk about, Douglas County, Greene County, Stone County, and I think with under the umbrella of masked night riders,
Right.
functioning as vigilantes, functioning with the idea that they're attempting to reestablish law and order, and then watching that devolvement over into vendettas.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so much of the Bald Knobbers, regardless of location, is a cautionary tale,
Really
but an understandable one. So another thing that happens with the Bald Knobbers, because they were masked night riders, is conflating them with the Klan.
Yeah.
And that one is certainly with Taney County and with Christian County is very incorrect historically.
Right. And politically, just the opposite.
Very much so. And so oftentimes people are surprised. We're talking a lot
Mhm.
about Taney County right at the moment. And we'll transition over to Christian County briefly in a moment. But in the case of the Taney County bald knobbers, most of them were union men.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think that there's a lot of dramatic moving parts, but we're looking at, post-war. We're looking at post 1874 Homestead Act,
Mhm.
and we're looking at a situation in which largely, not exclusively, but largely Southern sympathizing or Confederate landowners who had been in this region in some cases, many cases, back to the 1830s, back to the 1820s, in few cases back before Missouri was a state, who were now being displaced by folks from Illinois, folks from Ohio, folks from Indiana, who suddenly the government that won
Yeah.
was now declaring these parcels of land available for sale at another location land office, and they're moving in and saying, guess what, we just bought 80 acres and we're comparatively affluent, we have strong union ties, etc. And there was pushback in that.
Yeah.
And people oftentimes assume that the pushback would have been the bald knobbers pushing back. No. there was outlaw action. There was judicial or court corruption
Mhm.
going on, and then it was essentially the Union Flatlanders, of which I'm one, who then were saying, now we're going to form vigilante justice. We're going to be the masked riders to put things right. So very, very complex. Taking that concept, the idea that in the case of the Taney County bald knobbers, heavily politically influenced or politically motivated. With the Christian County bald knobbers, it was morality motivated.
Yeah.
And not to put too fine of a point on it, but it was a response to industrialization. It
Mhm.
was a response to what was seen as a very unsavory crowd destroying the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And it was a response that is a classic Scotch-Irish honor response
Mhm.
from beginning to end. And so you had in Christian County, the Christian County bald knobbers were centered around Chadwick.
Mhm.
And so when I say that it was a response to industrialization and Union or Northern industrialization, in this case, the Chadwick Flyer, the rail spur had been built from Springfield to Chadwick. The railhead was at Chadwick, and that's where folks brought their ties, brought in their lumber to sell to the railroad that was feeding really Western expansion
Mhm.
and industrialization, North American industrialization in the post-war. We're not
Yeah.
only going to rebuild. I mean, this is fueling the railroad robber barons. This is fueling the
The Northern
ultimately
banks. Mhm.
Northern banks, the Indian Wars,
Mhm.
all of these things that, in hindsight, the logging, the wholesale logging of the Ozarks. There's people don't realize it. We have all of this beautiful forest in the Ozarks. Almost all of it is second or third growth, and
Mhm.
it was during this era, post-war era, when it suddenly became workable to wholesale lumber off mountain after mountain after mountain
Yeah.
and bring those ties to railheads that, you know, I there's multiple sides to look at this, but just from this perspective, I mean, it's the spoiling of Isengard.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
Didn't see it
it's
going right there, but yes.
straight into Tolkien. But it is that sort of extreme American exploitation with industry that we can decry now from the comfort of our living rooms, having reaped the profit from it.
Right.
So again, highly complex. There are multiple sides to this, but in this particular case, you have really what is an outside force coming in, and you have thousands of Ozark hillmen who are suddenly, instead of making next to nothing in terms of 1870s 1880s currency, can actually make, quote unquote, quite a bit of money by bringing in lumber. And there are stories of the teams, the mule teams, individuals who have, now this is the other side of it, these individuals who have put in a level of back-breaking work, the likes of which we in our modern era could almost not even comprehend, to cut down these trees by hand, to get them loaded onto wagons, to bring them in for things like a quarter at a time, but bringing them in. There's a great story that at Chadwick, at one point you could see the mules and the wagons loaded with lumber stretching for miles down, all coming in. Well, they would come in, they get paid with real money, which was a big deal for these hills in the 1870s and 1880s. And these were either they were single men or they were single when they were in town, one of the two.
Yes.
And there was a lot of saloons, there was a lot of brothels, there was a lot of, it was again, we've talked about how so many things that we recognize as part of the Old West happened in the Ozarks, or happened in the Ozarks first. Chadwick was one of those wild Old West frontier towns.
Yeah, in a real sense, it was much like Dodge City or Tombstone or someplace like that. It really was. But people just aren't familiar with that story now.
No.
And I think another thing with getting paid with the real money, it was also after the Civil War was really the first time that you had, quote, real money that you could spend anywhere, because that's when the greenback came in. And so most people don't think about it, but before that, if you had banknotes, they usually were just good at that bank, or maybe a few stores around who could then go to that bank. And so suddenly they're getting paid money, and they could go to Little Rock or St. Louis or Kansas City or wherever and spend that money and move on to the next adventure too, or go out west with it.
Yeah, the sense of,
it opened up a lot of opportunities.
It did. Economic freedom, the capacity to travel, lots and lots of things. So within this milieu, we have what ultimately ends up being a lot of local men and young men who, for all, evidence says that these were individuals who were there before all of this displacement and before all of this upheaval. And they took issue with the immorality of these changes. And you put yourself in their place, there is a logical and emotional case to be made for the sense that, we were here first. This was our town. We did not have all of these problems, and now we do. And so the formation of the Christian County of Bald Knobbers was very different in terms of its motivations, and it was headed up by Bull Creek Dave Walker. I've had the chance to meet one of his descendants, and many of his of the Walker family are still in the region, and I have an enormous amount of respect for this whole story, and have been to the farm, been out to the the actual locations. The Christian County Bald Knobbers met at the Bald Knobber Cave, which is on private property, and had the opportunity to go out there upon invitation. And coming down to the fact, once the stage has been set, that it really, it all, in the case of the Christian County Bald Knobbers, it ironically came about on March 11th, so we're right in there, of 1887, and Dave Walker had called a meeting at the cave, and had said that this is in danger of getting out of hand, and we need to call it. We need to disband. That this needs to be done. They essentially agreed. They got on their horses, and this was a very large group of men, because in the court case that results from this indicted 80 men.
Wow. I didn't realize it was quite that many. I knew it was more than ended up being convicted, but I didn't realize it was that many.
Yeah, of course, it ends up with conviction for 4, death penalty for 4, and it is, for me, incredibly powerful. I've gone down to the cave. I've come back up from the cave, and been on these hills now, and to hear the story told by one of the family's descendants while we're standing on the cave, that said, these 80 plus men ride up out of the holler, and the issue that had been discussed was an altercation, a continuing altercation with a man named William Edens, and they had, it's a little fuzzy, and I know there's documentation out there in terms of what William had done initially, but the Christian County Bald Knobbers had ultimately tied him to a tree and horsewhipped him.
Yeah.
And that, of course, gives a meaningful reason for him to have a grudge.
Yeah.
And he, very understandable as well. And he did. And what ultimately was the trigger point, or the flashpoint, for this final altercation in 1887 was that William Edens had gone into Chadwick, and he, somewhere along the line, he had shot a dog, and he went in bragging that he'd shot a bald knobber. Essentially calling the bald knobbers dogs. Modern sensibility, that might not mean anything, but for honor culture and hill folk with Scotch Irish heritage, those are fighting words.
Don't take it lightly.
No. And so, of course, on the night of March 11th, they ride up out of they've essentially agreed that they're going, the bald knobbers are done, they're going to disband, and they come up out of the holler on their horses, and Billy Walker, Wiley Matthews, John Matthews, his uncle, and about half of the band split and head for the Edens Ranch,
basically just ignoring what they had agreed to.
Yes, and what Dave Walker had insisted upon. They go, and this is, all of these moving parts, because they go to the Edens Ranch, and nobody's home. And the issue was that William Edens and his wife were actually at James, his father's cabin,
Mhm.
James and Elizabeth Eden's. And there's some question, that they may have all been holed up there for fear, uh,
Yeah.
in anticipation of this. Um, the issue at hand is that Charles Green, who's a neighbor, um, was also there. His children were there. Um, Melvina, James and Elizabeth's daughter, was there, sick with the measles. Uh, this was a house full of women and children,
Hmm.
and it is a little fuzzy in terms of what actually happens, but the Baldnobber massacre involves them smashing in the windows, smashing in the door, sticking shotguns into the house, and opening fire. Um, William is killed. Charles Green is killed. Um, James, William's father, is severely injured by getting hit in the head with an axe. This is a really horrible crime,
Hmm.
and it just is rapidly devolved. And then for what ultimately for the Baldnobbers was the final blow, so to speak, was that in the struggle, Charles Green's wife pulls off one of the Baldnobbers' masks and recognizes Billy Walker, who was 17, and recognizes him because he doesn't have a beard, because he's too young to grow one. And this the massacre at the Eden's cabin results in 80 men being indicted. It's a nationwide
Yeah.
media frenzy, and ultimately results in the conviction of Bull Creek Dave Walker, his at the time 17-year-old son Billy, um, Deacon John Matthews, and John Matthews' nephew Wiley Matthews. And there is a jailbreak in this process. Wiley uh, escapes. It is strongly rumored that he escaped to Indian Territory and was never apprehended. Bull Creek Dave Walker held such regard for the system that even when during the jailbreak and the door's wide open, he refuses to leave the jail because he is convinced that the jury will find him innocent, because he was doing everything he could to keep the massacre from happening.
Yeah.
And then on May 10th of 1889, over 2 years later, Dave Walker, his son Billy, and John Matthews are hanged on the Ozark Square in what is ultimately a really horrifying process in which they have to be hanged multiple times because they keep screwing it up.
Yeah, it was a botched hanging.
Yes. What I find incredibly captivating about the story is the difficult humanity of everyone involved.
Hmm.
And then for me personally, Bull Creek Dave and his son Billy are buried at the Sparta Cemetery, the old Sparta Cemetery, which I go by weekly.
Hmm.
And Deacon John Matthews is buried on what is now State Forest, but I've been to his grave, and if I were to conjecture, if I were to speculate just a little, I would say that he haunts it. but it is not a malevolent haunting.
Mhm. Well, it
It
was
is,
his own, it was his property at the time, before it
yes,
was Park, National
yes.
Park.
And it was the and this is the part that really strikes home for me, and I think it's for me probably the most important part to share of the story, and not to take away from, the whole situation with Bull Creek Dave and his son Billy. um but we have this sort of these preset notions of villains,
Mhm.
and these preset notions of villains are, I don't know, certainly not the kind of people that these people were.
Right. Well, we tend to think in terms of the white hat and the black hat, and everything is very stark and one dimensional, good
Hmm.
or bad. And it's a story that the people involved were more complex than that. They did, yes, they did wrong things, they did some horrible things, but that wasn't the only aspect to them.
No, and there was a point, finally making it to the location, to Matthew's grave, standing beside his grave, watching the sunset over the ridges. The cemetery, which is a family plot, is just catty cornered off the south end of what would have been his house, his
Hmm.
cabin. And the Walkers were interred in the Sparta cemetery. They would have been taken by wagon number of miles out
Hmm.
from Ozark to Sparta,
Yeah.
presumably on what is now Highway 14. And Matthew's last request, his dying request, was to be buried next to his children, at the corner of the cabin that I would strongly suspect he built by hand,
Hmm.
on the homestead that he loved, looking up at the ridges.
Yeah.
And that level of humanization,
Hmm.
to me, it makes me emotional every time. It made me emotional at the location. That's not to take away, that does not diminish the crime at the Eden's cabin
No.
by any stretch of the imagination, but it humanizes this man in a way that I think is both incredibly beautiful and also makes us very uncomfortable.
Exactly. And I think that's the thing that gets lost in a lot of stories. And you see it in current events all the time when people are discussing, any particular situation, crime or whatever, and very quickly you see um, uh, commentary, and you see it even more now that you have social media, that just denigrating whatever happens in a court case. How could that happen? And
Hmm.
often because they don't know all of the circumstances involved, and they don't know that human story.
Hmm.
They get the headlines, and so a lot of people in the public will just default to, well, we have a failed system, or this is horrible, without, by basically reading the first paragraph of a book and not knowing the rest of it.
Yes, and
Mhm.
and in some cases not being able to,
Yeah.
simply not, either from lack of information or for the simple fact that many of us are not trained,
Mhm.
to understand the system, the judicial system at hand, or just because we're not interested.
They're not interested until they see that headline, and then they go, "Oh, how can that be?"
Yeah,
And it's like, well,
very.
it happens all the time, but this is a good illustration of that. That there can be a human side to a very dark story.
Yes, yes, and I can say that visiting his grave made an extraordinary impact on me. And like I said, it's one of those things that just there's no way that I can prove this. I didn't have any investigative equipment with me. I was just there.
Mhm.
But I was there at probably my favorite time of the day, which was twilight. It
Yeah.
was that transitional time, and it's difficult to say, but there was an overwhelming sense of both sadness and peace.
Mhm. And which
That
would make sense there.
it was it was it was and this too, I think, speaks a little bit into some of our collective approach to these topics. um I was I was standing next to a hanged man's um grave in the middle of the forest, framed by ridges of mountain ridges, and no sense of malevolence at this point.
Mhm.
This was not a dark place. This was not a scary place. This was not a place where the proverbial terrifying horror movie hand comes out of the ground. If anything, I got the sense that the presence there was glad that we were there so that we could see that it was special too.
There you go. Which is what makes these stories interesting.
It is. And not saying that we don't occasionally encounter, you know, things that push back,
That's true. That does happen sometimes. Not that
but
often, but it does.
mhm. And it's I love the reality of what I would consider to be somewhat empathetic or compassionate paranormal investigation is so much more complex than the one-sided, oh, it's a haunting, it's going to get us, run.
Yeah.
Which
Very,
stands to reason. Human beings are complex.
that's very true. That's very true.
Oh, so that's one of my favorites. How about you, Lisa?
Well, I thought uh, jump into something that's completely, in a way, completely different, but not from that story. And
Hmm.
that is some of the recurring urban legends in the Ozarks.
Yes,
Um,
a lot of fun with
and
those.
and it, one thing that surprised me, a couple of the themes that come up over and over in the urban legends in the region um, tend to really be uniform. A preoccupation with albinos,
Yes.
um, hatchets being involved, and murderous caretakers of properties.
Yes. And I believe in some form or another, this is a Scooby-Doo episode.
That's I joked about that earlier. That's it's pretty much there. I think there was an episode that pretty much had all of this in there, um, and most of these stories really gained traction after World War II, particularly in the 50s and 60s. And I think part of it, one, is sort of the increasing impact of pop culture,
Hmm.
particularly media, TV, and movies.
Hmm.
So more use of tropes. Um, and then I think almost as a reaction to not having sort of that real upheaval and scary stories. We didn't have widespread stories like the Civil War and the ball daubers and vigilante justice and um, the carousing and so forth from, say, the railroad towns and the mining towns, etc. All of that was ending and moving further west, and suddenly the stories that start getting traction are these urban legends that have more exaggerated characters to them.
Agreed. And I think there's because this does seem to be a heavily post-war
Hmm. It really does.
phenomenon. The mass communication, the fact that we're now seeing, I think there's a lot of really interesting moving parts that oftentimes are more social commentary than they are actual event.
Yeah.
But that in one sense, of course, you could classify it for the United States, post-war United States, or during war United States. We're moving from 1944, 45 into the 1955 on to 1960. That's the sort of the era there. By this point, everyone has a radio, and then by the end of that, pretty much everyone has a TV.
Yes.
Mass media through newspapers, books, etc., has really reached its its apex in terms of availability. And the nation has experienced what I would classify as mass economic upheaval, but we associate economic upheaval with the idea of an economic collapse. In this case, it's the opposite of that.
True. Rapid expansion and improvement in standard of living.
Yes. The idea that mass destabilization through improvement, the creation of the suburbs, the fact that in a comparative, really within this time frame, the majority of Americans went to living a rural lifestyle to living an urban lifestyle. And with that, it's and World War II really was the issue, because you saw mass industrialization to meet the war effort, and tens of thousands of Americans coming out of the Depression looking for work, moving to those urban industrialized centers because there was good work to be had. And
I know I had family members who did that. They went to Oklahoma City to work in the aircraft plants.
yes.
Came off farms to do that, and it really did change things. And I think there's a couple of things that when you look at these urban legends, you have to put in context. One is serial radio programs that were just pre-World War II, and then as we get into the post-war period, you had a lot of what people would probably call soap opera type radio programs that had a noir quality to them. They were scary stories, mysteries, and sort of the kind of stories. So people were kind of getting used to this more gothic storytelling. And then you have particularly World War II, and you have this very unifying, but in some ways very monolithic enemy. And so everyone's on the same page that, the Axis powers are bad, and we do everything we can. And then after the war, as we get into the Cold War, it's a little less concrete, the situation and the threats, but the threat still is there. And, I think that from a folkloric point of view, that a lot of these urban legends come out of that need for being able to tell our boogeyman stories, but it's kind of hard to tell them when it's, that ephemeral threat of whether or not a missile's coming or not.
Yes, we have that. We have that. It's really kind of a heady mix that it's surprising that we made it out as well as we did.
Yeah.
Of of every everything is going so well, in the sense that you know
Economically, etc. But
yes, we have suburbs, we have good jobs, we have improved transit system, we have plentiful food, we have, comparatively speaking, plentiful income, we have income security through good, industrialized jobs. We have the formations of what's now incredibly nostalgic as the American dream. Get your 4-year
yeah,
degree and get a great job and everything's going to be great. Retire with a pension. Who knew? Anyway,
it
but
lasted a while.
yeah, it was great while it lasted.
Mhm.
But with within that, then you have the the sudden uprootedness, the
Mhm.
loss of ties to the past, the loss, that everything is new. Everything that's gone before has suddenly sort of been ripped away, and
Yeah.
at the same time, we're living under the threat that we could all be annihilated by a nuclear blast at any moment.
Yeah.
And likely several times we nearly were.
Well, it's come out that yes, there were definitely some pretty close calls
Yeah,
both directions. So
yeah, and so these looming threats in the midst of, oh, but everything's great,
yeah,
and a sense of loss, that it's difficult to put your finger on, because what you're saying, and I particularly appreciate this, the idea that you're saying, oh, we've uprooted, we've lost our ties, we've lost our, the say, suddenly you're living in an impersonal neighborhood, you're living in a, far away from where your family's from, where your
mhm,
clan is from, so to speak. Everything is strange, and yet everything is so good that you would be a bad American to say there's something wrong.
right. And especially as suburbs were built, and you have those nice, neat little identical houses, and everything's brand new, and everyone was trying to. There was a big push to get rid of everything old because people had lived with it through the Depression and the war because they couldn't replace things because things were tight
Yes.
and rationing, and so it was a sweeping away of things. And so I think that there's that unconscious, we have an unconscious need for conflict in our storytelling. And
Hmm.
uh, just the way that we train our brains and how we learn, what our tribe is and how we view the world. And um, so I think we ended up coming up with these caricatures. Um, and the albino gets me. I'm not sure why an albino per se was so prominent, other than perhaps it is sort of reminiscent of someone that's gone through radiation exposure, etc. Something that's different like that. Um, and you had the albino farm outside
Hmm.
Springfield, which there was no albino.
There was a farm.
There was a farm, the Sheedy's farm, the poor Sheedys, as the college kids started tormenting them. Um, there was no caretaker, of any sort, much less the albino. Later on, very much later on, security was hired. It got to the point where they had to have security out there. But that's the closest that came. But you had this idea of this albino, somehow caretaker of the farm, carrying around a hatchet, killing people.
Yes.
And now it is a conflation with another urban legend that's not far from there, Hatchet Man's Bridge, where you have a hatchet, a man killing people with a hatchet, and somehow it all gets mixed up. Um, and and again, even with that one, while there are a lot of axe murders in the in the history of the Ozarks, there really isn't a real one that can be pinned down to that bridge area. So why it ended up being at that bridge is it's hard to say. It's fuzzy.
It is. It
And
really is.
but I do think one reason that you tend to get hatchet, because there's these similar stores. There's some out of Arkansas, there's some up around Rolla, there's some up towards St. Louis. And I think the hatchet is just that symbol of that very dangerous weapon. It's very personal, easily manipulated and handled, that can kill you so easily.
And it,
I think that symbolism tends to be kind of universal, but
I think so. I think it's, and of course, this is turning back to mid-century. We don't just have hatchets around the house these days, but mid-century and prior, the hatchet was an everyday tool. You needed the hatchet to chop up your firewood to work in the kitchen, or to heat your home. So mom uses a hatchet, grandma uses a hatchet, dad uses a hatchet, kids learn to use the hatchet. Hatchet is just there, but in the hands of a sociopath psycho who snaps, that suddenly I think becomes the bloody instrument of choice for these very bloody domestic murders of certainly of the 19th century and then early in the 20th century.
Whereas I think in more recent decades, it turns to things like baseball bats and things like that.
Yeah,
which
or
were more commonplace.
Kitchen cutlery, the meat cleaver, that kind of thing. But still, even now there is something just exceptionally evocative and chilling about the imagery of the bloody hatchet.
That's true. And of course, in the national mind, part of that probably does come from the Lizzie Borden case.
Yeah.
Because it was so infamous, and you get the rhyme out of it,
Yes.
And
it's visceral. It's extraordinarily visceral. It's and for whatever reason, I mean, if you got hacked to death with a hatchet or shot with a gun, you're all the same dead, but there is something deeply unsettling about that imagery as opposed to somebody got shot, although it's a more horrifying.
Personal weapon, if you want to put it that way.
It is a more personal weapon. What do you think? There was something that crossed my mind. I'm wondering if this might be a sort of a psychosocial commonality. We see the development of this urban legend coming out of the uprootedness, the America in transition and that sort of thing. But the seeking out urban legend is definitely seen as the domain of the college student group. And college students are by nature uprooted through their experience.
Right. That's true. By definition, even if they're living at home, they are suddenly in a new environment, a new set of people, learning, sort of broadening the horizons, and being tamed, if you want to look at it that way, being tamed for society. And so that thrill seeking, of pursuing urban legends, is a way of kind of staying a little bit on the primal side, perhaps. I don't know.
I think so. I think there's something really, before we get into caretakers, I'm fascinated by caretakers. But there is something, I think there's something here that so we see two commonalities with college students transition and really just the larger American, I would classify it as the working class, but working class would also include academic job working class. The transition of Americans as a whole, nationwide, from about 1940, three, probably the really where the industrialization of the war effort got its feet under it, certainly by 1943, until about 1960. That on one hand you have uprootedness, the separation from really the separation from clan and hearth.
Yeah.
That uprootedness, but at the same time you see a heavy social domestication. You're going to get a good job, you're going to get a nice house, you're going to get a very staid life. This is what you wanted.
Or at least what we told you wanted.
Exactly. This is you're gonna live the American dream, damn it. You're gonna enjoy it. And you're gonna have 1.3 kids and 2.5 garage.
That's right.
And you're going to hoard so much crap that you're not going to be able to get your garage. Anyway, never mind about my garage. That
That's another story.
an entirely other story. That you have we associate the rootlessness with the wild on the road transients, the lone cowboy, the gypsy caravan, the sort of the circus, on the road, all of these sorts of things. But in reality, the great rootlessness, the being uprooted from clan and hearth, came with depending on who you are, an almost suffocating level of domestication.
That's true. And perhaps part of the fascination for kids going through that is that if they can seek out these places of these urban legends and they can, quote, defeat them, come out unscathed, they're proving that they aren't losing their edge, their resourcefulness, etc. And that they're beating, quote, in sort of that collective mind, they're beating the rube.
Yes, I think that I think from a psychosocial standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, there's a lot of these elements that are feeding into this to make you want to, first of all, to become obsessed with the idea that there is the albino farm out there, and or whatever. There is the Devil Bridge. There is the Hatchet Man. There is the Bloody Mary in the mirror. You're going to go out there. You're going to antagonize. You're going to tempt fate, and you are going to presumably survive.
And no matter how domesticated you've become, you're not scared.
Yes, and I think while it you can't what to me is particularly interesting is that if you are well grounded within hearth and clan, and that your survival is in and of itself difficult, that I suspect this type of creation of boogeymen is a lot less prevalent, because you have plenty of real life.
Exactly. And I think that's why some of these urban legends became more exaggerated caricatures.
And we've got throughout the Missouri Ozarks, we've got witch legends, we've got
albino zombies.
We've got zombies, and then we got albino zombies, because zombies weren't all by themselves weren't scary enough. And,
no, apparently not.
and I think what's particularly telling in this is you see a lot of the zombie legends happening in the 1970s and the 1980s, after we actually got told what zombies were by pop culture.
Exactly. And that's what I'm saying is, I think beforehand you had these albino centered kind of stories, and just the creepy caretakers. And then it morphed into zombies, etc., as pop culture embraced those ideas from the Caribbean, etc.
And from, in all reality, from sci-fi.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
one of my favorite films is the original Night of the Living Dead,
Oh yeah. Same.
and 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 one another possible pop culture element that I'm going to throw in here just for possible consideration is the circus sideshow.
That, well, I mean, that's true. Of course, it was subsiding by the time you got into the 50s and 60s.
Hmm.
But you also had you used to have a lot of freak shows, like Coney Island and different, state fairs, etc. And as those things started going away, it's almost that these kind of caricatures morphed into urban legends. Then
Yes, and
you couldn't
I'm just
see them anymore, so now there's stories. Oh well, you can find that type of thing if you go out here far enough down this road, kind of story.
right, and that's, I think that there's a lot of moving parts. What do you think about the killer caretaker? What do you think about that motif?
I think it's that fear of betrayal, that someone's entrusted um, with either a place or several of the stories, even some versions of the albino farm story, and down at Hoffman's Mansion, and there's others that their summer camps became a part of it. That
Yeah,
there was a summer camp, and kids would go down there, um, and then the caretaker was killing people, um, and the thing of it is, some of these stories that they really predate the rise of the slasher films in the late 70s, so you can't blame it on you know
right.
uh, on those movies,
On
because the stories were already there, and then they made the movies based on these legends that were going around in various places around the country. But
I think that's
I think
very
it's that
interesting.
sense of being vulnerable, because of course you're out, summer camp or place, you're in an unfamiliar area, and then the people entrusted to take care of you are your worst enemy.
Yes, which, not to get too academically highfalutin on this, but uh, certainly the potential of tapping into a primal response against essentially the authoritarian structures that Americans found themselves within. The
Yeah.
idea that, the job, the school, the government, the
Hmm.
idea that all of these systems are here to take care of you and
Yeah.
to provide for you and to ensure your safety. And in the back of our perhaps more primal minds going, really?
Well, and I think you saw that more. I think part of the reason you start seeing more of those kind of films and everything in pop culture in the mid to late 70s is people start questioning those ideas more after Watergate and things like that. It's a
Yes.
way of processing those subconscious thoughts of we can't trust what they tell us, we can't trust who they tell us to follow, kind of thing.
Yes. Which I think you can even draw an arc um, from those real life events spurring into a cultural sensibility,
Hmm.
and the idea that, interestingly enough, that the cultural sensibility exists not below the subconscious but right in that in between line where we're all thinking the same thing but we're not talking about it.
Yes, particularly in the earlier stages of those kinds of changes, I think that happens. It's it's bubbling in the surface there, but no one's really saying it, and it tends to come out in storytelling, whether
Mm,
it's between a group of kids around a bonfire or someone writing a movie script.
yes. And one direction that I was thinking that was interesting, that a lot of these layers of mistrust,
Hmm.
some 30 years later, bubble out in the form of the X-Files.
That's true. The X Files, and then you can even you can trace it on down to things like The Walking Dead and other things. I mean, it's still playing with the same themes.
And then the situation where concepts that of course have much more original roots being essentially served up to a very broad American public in the form of the X-Files, then a situation of life then beginning to imitate art in
Yeah.
terms of our questioning of government secrets and the men in black and the helicopters and the black ooze and uh you know
And really, and really, what that's no different than talking about the Watergate papers, except for people feel a little more comfortable exploring those topics when you're not talking about that concrete real. I know this situation happened. We may not know all the details, but we can talk about it in a fictional context and explore those ideas, and people are more comfortable with that.
yes, I think there's so many things I throw this out to our folks who are watching and listening. What are your thoughts? What are some of the things that have impacted you? uh Put them in the comments. We'd love to read them and get
Mhm.
your take on this. What might be a interesting discussion point to close, we're almost at 9 o'clock, which I think is
Yeah, we are.
phenomenal, and we've barely even touched our list. uh
Yeah.
Tune in next week.
Yeah.
But something that oh so okay, so this is I want to throw this out here. I do not know the answer to this question. I just find it a really fascinating discussion topic, directly related to paranormal and ghosts, really.
Okay.
um Certainly back in the turn of middle of the 19th century, we'll go middle of the 19th century,
Okay.
on through the Civil War, post Civil War, we saw the rise of the spiritualist movement.
Hmm.
um we saw what appears to be a really mainstream acceptance of the paranormal.
Hmm.
So much so that, of course, it was hijacked by charlatans
Yeah.
as well, in addition to other things. But we see just a what seems to be just a that it was not uncommon to say I've had a paranormal experience, or I believe in ghosts, or I contacted a spiritualist because I was trying to make contact with a
Or have
loved
Friday night
one.
seance in the living room in the 50s. I mean, those things were very common.
Hmm. Now, something that I know that you and I both experienced, we seem to be coming out of it at this point, but there's a broad period of time where saying something like I believe in ghosts, or I believe that my house is haunted, um, comes with enormous social stigma,
Hmm.
um, to the point that there can be fear of ostracization. um, don't tell anybody that the house is haunted because we want to sell it.
Yeah.
uh, which is starting to make the transition to please tell everybody that my house is haunted because I want to sell it,
Exactly.
depending on the neighborhood.
Hmm.
But we're seeing that transition. Where do you think the stigmatization took root?
The Exorcist.
That's fair.
I really do. Because that was the point that people started suddenly boohooing Ouija boards and seances and anything that perceived as communicating with the other side. Now, granted, depending on geographic location and certain demographics, there were certain groups that, were always more fearful of the paranormal. But the broad sweep, the change came with the premiere of The Exorcist and people literally fainting in theaters and so forth and going, oh my God, this, something like this can happen, which to me is a testament to Peter Blatty's writing ability and how well the movie was made, that it really did affect discourse in the country
Yes.
for the next 30 years until and that really didn't start changing until around the turn of the millennium, with some of the reality shows starting to highlight the paranormal again and making it acceptable to talk about. So for about 30 years, one movie and book put a kibosh on the subject.
On talking about ghosts. I think that's phenomenal. Of course, if it's one thing that I hope that, we leave people with, is that there's, life is messy. Human beings are messy. Things are problematic for sure. Hauntings do happen. And in the vast majority of them, they are not malevolent.
That's right. I guess the one other thing I should throw in there that sort of was the intermediate step in there was the Ghostbusters movies, which ironically was not just comedy, but Dan Aykroyd wrote the original movie based on his family's history as spiritualists and ghost hunters. So
I love that.
Yeah, and so that started people at least joking and talking about it in a comedic sense, and then later on we get into the quote the reality version of it that has opened the topic,
as opposed to the fantasy version of it. I love that. I'm a huge fan of the Ghostbusters, both films from the 80s, and a huge Dan Aykroyd fan. I think he's awesome.
Me too. But yeah, his grandfather and his father, and the whole family for 2 or 3 generations were spiritualists and researchers. So
that is awesome. So life imitating art, art imitating life. Depending on where you're at within the cycle, it can either be terrifying or a beautiful circle.
Exactly. That's probably a good spot to end on tonight.
That sounds good.
Hope everyone has a great week. Go check out tickets to come see us at the Ritchie Mansion in April. Go check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, and just have a great week, and we will see you next Wednesday.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Lisa. And thank you, Alex.
Yep. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, everyone.